Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life Unraveled. Douglas Herrera stood at his office window on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard. At 38, he had built everything from nothing, a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate espionage and personal security. His military background and intelligence had served him well in civilian life, teaching him patience, precision, and most importantly, how to read people. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who made his living uncovering lies had been living one for the past 3 years. It started with small things. Margaret's sudden interest in yoga classes that ran impossibly late. New lingerie that never made appearances in their bedroom. Credit card charges at restaurants he'd never been to, always for 2 people. But what sealed his suspicions was something far more subtle. The way she looked at him had changed. The guilt was there, swimming beneath the surface of her green eyes like a predator waiting to strike. Margaret Williamson had been a stunning catch when they married 5 years ago. A pediatric nurse with flowing auburn hair and a laugh that could light up rooms. She'd seemed genuinely impressed by his success, his discipline, his unwavering loyalty. They'd tried for children for 2 years before she announced her pregnancy with twins. Douglas had been overjoyed, finally achieving the family he'd always wanted. But now, as he held the DNA results in his steady hands, those dreams crumbled like ancient parchment. Not the father. Probability, 0%. The twins, Emma and Ryan, whom he'd loved unconditionally for 18 months, shared none of his genetic material. Someone else had fathered them while his wife smiled at breakfast and planned birthday parties and played the perfect mother. Douglas's phone buzzed. A text from his surveillance team. Subject is at the Meridian Hotel, room 412. Male companion identified as Kurt Shea, 35, construction foreman. They've been meeting twice weekly for 8 months. 8 months. The affair had started when the twins were 10 months old, which meant it likely began much earlier. Perhaps even before conception. Douglas set down the DNA results and picked up Kurt Shea's background file. Divorced twice, owed significant child support to his first wife, a history of job hopping and minor fraud charges that never stuck. A predator who'd likely targeted Margaret for her association with Douglas's wealth. Or perhaps Margaret had done the targeting. Douglas opened his laptop and began typing, his fingers moving with military precision across the keyboard. If there was one thing his years in intelligence had taught him, it was that revenge was a dish best served with meticulous planning and flawless execution. Phase 1 would be information gathering. He already had Kurt's employment records, financial statements, and personal history. But he needed more: bank records, phone logs, email accounts, social media activity. Every digital footprint that could reveal the full scope of their deception. Phase 2 would be psychological manipulation. Douglas understood people's weaknesses better than most. Kurt's financial desperation made him predictable. Margaret's need for security and social status provided leverage. He would use both against them. Phase 3 would be the grand revelation. Time for maximum destruction of their carefully constructed lies. His office door chimed softly as his assistant knocked. "Mr. Herrera, your wife is here to see you." Douglas smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "Send her in, Christina." Margaret entered wearing the navy dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, her voice carrying that slight tremor he'd learned to recognize as guilt. "I was in the neighborhood after my doctor's appointment." "Doctor's appointment?" Douglas leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Everything all right? Just routine." She avoided his eyes. "Listen, I was wondering if we could talk about maybe taking a family vacation soon. The twins have been asking about the beach." "The twins. Not our twins, or Emma and Ryan. Just the twins." As if some unconscious part of her knew they weren't his. Douglas stood and walked around his desk, stopping just close enough to make her uncomfortable. He'd learned this technique in interrogation training. Invade personal space to create psychological pressure. "A vacation sounds wonderful," he said softly. I've been thinking we need to spend more quality time together as a family. Maybe somewhere remote. Private, where we can really talk. Margaret's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Relief? It was hard to tell. That sounds perfect, she said, reaching up to kiss his cheek. Her lips felt cold against his skin. After she left, Douglas returned to his desk and opened a new file on his computer. He labeled it simply, Margaret and Kurt, Complete Destruction. The game had begun. Chapter 2, The Hunter's Web. 3 weeks later, Douglas sat in his home office reviewing surveillance footage while the sounds of his wife bathing the twins drifted down the hallway. The domesticity of all would have been heartwarming if he didn't know the truth. His investigation had yielded disturbing results. Kurt Shea wasn't just Margaret's lover. He was her high school boyfriend from 15 years ago. They'd reconnected through social media 2 years before Douglas and Margaret married, maintaining sporadic contact that intensified after their wedding. But the real discovery came from Kurt's financial records. 3 large cash deposits had been made to his account over the past 4 years, each coinciding with major purchases Margaret had made using Douglas's money. A new car, expensive jewelry, a family vacation to Europe. Someone was funneling money to Kurt, and Douglas had a strong suspicion who. Margaret wasn't just cheating. She was systematically looting their joint accounts to fund her lover's lifestyle. Douglas's secure phone rang. Gary Winters, his most trusted operative, was calling from across town. I'm at Kurt's apartment. Gary's voice was low and professional. You need to see what I found in his bedroom. 20 minutes later, Douglas stood in Kurt Shea's cramped apartment, staring at a wall covered in photographs. Pictures of him leaving his office, entering restaurants, playing with the twins at the park. Someone had been watching him for months, documenting his daily routines with military precision. There's more, Gary said, leading him to a closet. Inside was a metal filing cabinet containing detailed notes about Douglas's business, his clients, his personal relationships, financial statements, copies of legal documents, even transcripts of phone conversations that could only have been recorded with sophisticated surveillance equipment. This isn't just an affair, Douglas said quietly. This is industrial espionage. Gary nodded grimly. Kurt's been hired to gather intelligence on you and your company. The question is by whom? Douglas examined the files more carefully. Many of the documents related to his most sensitive cases, divorce investigations involving high-profile clients, corporate espionage work for Fortune 500 companies, personal security assessments for celebrities and politicians. Information that could destroy careers and end marriages if it fell into the wrong hands. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Yoga class running late tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. Douglas showed the message to Gary, who checked his watch. She's supposed to be at yoga. Want me to verify? No need. Douglas photographed the surveillance wall with his phone. I know exactly where she is. They were at Kurt's backup apartment across town, the one Gary had discovered through utility records. Douglas had been tracking Margaret's phone through the GPS app they'd installed for family safety. She thought she was being clever, but she was actually providing him with a detailed record of every secret meeting. Douglas spent another hour photographing documents and gathering evidence. Kurt's surveillance operation was sophisticated and expensive, suggesting a well-funded adversary. Someone wanted to destroy Douglas's business and reputation, and they were using his own wife to do it. Back home, Douglas found Margaret asleep in their bed, her hair damp from a shower that smelled of Kurt's cologne. She'd grown careless, or perhaps she simply didn't respect Douglas enough to hide her tracks effectively. He stood in the doorway watching her sleep, feeling nothing but cold calculation. This woman had shared his bed, his dreams, his trust. She played mother to children that weren't his while systematically betraying everything he'd built. In his study, Douglas opened a secure laptop and began composing emails to his most reliable contacts. If Margaret and Kurt thought they were running a sophisticated game, they were about to learn what real professionals could accomplish. First, he contacted Russell Hanna, a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing hidden assets. Russell would audit every financial transaction Margaret had made in the past 5 years, building an unbreakable case of financial fraud. Next, he reached out to Julius Kane, a former NSA operative who now worked in corporate counterintelligence. Julius would identify whoever was funding Kurt's surveillance operation and turn their own tactics against them. Finally, he sent a carefully worded message to Judge Fernando Bush, whom he'd helped years earlier in a sensitive personal matter. Fernando owed him a significant favor, and Douglas was finally ready to collect. The envelope he'd prepared contained DNA test results, financial records, surveillance photographs, and recorded conversations. But that was just the beginning. What Margaret and Kurt didn't know was that Douglas had been feeding them false information for weeks, leading them deeper into a trap of his own design. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late to escape. Douglas closed the laptop and walked to his bedroom window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, his enemies thought they were winning. They thought they'd outsmarted a man whose business was uncovering lies and protecting secrets. Tomorrow, he would begin phase 2 of his plan. Margaret would receive divorce papers demanding full custody of the twins and financial compensation for fraud. Kurt would discover that his surveillance operation had been compromised from the beginning. And whoever was pulling their strings would learn that Douglas Herrera never forgave betrayal. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. Douglas sat across from his lawyer, Jeff Hampton, in the mahogany-paneled conference room where they drafted countless strategies for his corporate clients. Today, the strategy was deeply personal. "The evidence is overwhelming," Jeff said, reviewing the files Douglas had provided. "Financial fraud, adultery, conspiracy to commit industrial espionage. We could pursue criminal charges, but the civil case will be more devastating to them personally." Douglas nodded. "I want them destroyed, not imprisoned. Prison would be too easy." Jeff raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" Margaret filed for divorce this morning, demanding alimony and child support for the twins. She claims I'm a biological father, therefore responsible for $20,000 monthly support payments. Douglas smiled coldly. "She's walking directly into my trap." The divorce filing had been predictable. Douglas's intelligence sources had warned him that Margaret's unknown benefactor was pushing for an aggressive legal strategy. They wanted to clean out his assets while simultaneously destroying his reputation through leaked information about his clients. What they didn't know was that Douglas had been feeding them fabricated intelligence for months. Every document Kurt had photographed, every conversation he'd recorded, every financial statement he'd copied contained carefully crafted lies designed to lead his enemies towards specific actions. "The paternity test will destroy her credibility," Jeff continued. "But you mentioned wanting to expose whoever's funding this operation." Douglas opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. "Kent Harrison, CEO of Harrison Industries. My company exposed his embezzlement scheme 2 years ago, costing him his marriage, his company, and nearly landing him in federal prison. He's been planning revenge ever since." The investigation had taken months, but Julius Kane had finally traced the money flowing to Kurt through a series of shell corporations. Kent Harrison was funding the entire operation, using Margaret and Kurt as pawns in his quest for vengeance against Douglas. "Harrison approached Margaret 18 months ago," Douglas explained. "He offered her financial freedom in exchange for information about my business and clients. She was supposed to seduce me into revealing confidential information, but when that failed, they escalated to industrial espionage." Jeff whistled low. "This is bigger than a simple affair. Much bigger. Harrison has been blackmailing my former clients using information stolen from my files. 3 CEOs have already paid him significant sums to prevent their personal secrets from becoming public. Margaret wasn't just cheating. She was helping him destroy innocent people's lives." Douglas had spent weeks documenting Harrison's blackmail scheme, gathering evidence that would not only exonerate his clients, but send Harrison to federal prison for extortion and racketeering. The FBI was already building a case based on Douglas's intelligence. "What about Kurt?" Jeff asked. Kurt thought he was just having an affair with a lonely housewife. He had no idea he was part of a larger conspiracy until Harrison started paying him for surveillance work. By then, he was in too deep to back out. Douglas's expression hardened. Ignorance isn't innocence. He made his choice. Over the past week, Douglas had orchestrated the final phase of his plan with surgical precision. Margaret had been fed false information suggesting that Douglas was planning to flee the country with hidden assets. She'd passed this information to Kurt, who'd shared it with Harrison, prompting them to accelerate their timeline. The divorce filing was their attempt to freeze Douglas's assets before he could allegedly escape. What they didn't realize was that Douglas had anticipated this move and prepared accordingly. "The court hearing is tomorrow," Jeff said. "Are you ready for this?" Douglas thought about Emma and Ryan, the children he'd loved as his own for 18 months. They were innocent victims in this game, but he couldn't allow sentiment to cloud his judgment. Margaret had made them weapons against him, and he would respond accordingly. "I've been ready for months," he replied. That evening, Douglas sat in his study preparing the envelope that would end Margaret's charade forever. Inside were DNA test results, financial records proving her theft of marital assets, surveillance photographs of her meetings with Kurt, recorded conversations revealing the conspiracy with Harrison, and bank records showing payments from Harrison's shell corporations. But the real surprise was the federal warrant for Harrison's arrest that would be executed simultaneously with tomorrow's court hearing. Douglas had coordinated with the FBI to ensure maximum impact and media coverage. His phone rang. Gary Winters was calling from his surveillance position outside Kurt's apartment. "They're panicking," Gary reported. "Margaret arrived an hour ago with 2 suitcases. They're planning to run." "Let them." Douglas had expected this. "Are the tracking devices still active?" "Both their phones and her car. We'll know their location within 10 feet. Douglas had planted the tracking devices weeks ago, anticipating that Margaret and Kurt would eventually attempt to flee. When they did, federal marshals would be waiting for them. "Sir," Gary's voice carried a note of concern. "What about the twins?" Douglas felt a momentary pang of something that might have been regret. Margaret made them part of this when she lied about their paternity. They'll be safer with their biological father once this is over. The conversation ended, and Douglas returned to his preparations. Tomorrow, in front of a packed courtroom, Margaret would demand $20,000 monthly in child support for children that weren't his. She would lie under oath, committing perjury in pursuit of money that belonged to her victims. And Douglas would present evidence that would not only destroy her credibility, but expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. The envelope sat on his desk like a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment when he would hand it to Judge Fernando Bush and watch Margaret's carefully constructed world collapse into ruins. Justice, Douglas had learned, was not about forgiveness or redemption. It was about consequences delivered with mathematical precision to those who betrayed trust. Tomorrow, Margaret and Kurt would learn that lesson in the most public and humiliating way possible. Chapter 4. The Courtroom Gambit. The Hamilton County Family Court buzzed with unusual energy as Douglas entered through the main doors. Word had somehow leaked about the high-profile divorce case, drawing reporters and curious observers who sensed drama unfolding. Douglas wore his navy pinstripe suit like armor, his military bearing evident in every measured step. Beside him, Jeff Hampton carried a briefcase containing weapons more devastating than any explosive device. Across the courtroom, Margaret sat with her attorney, Shelby Lucas, an ambitious young lawyer known for aggressive tactics in divorce proceedings. Margaret had chosen well. Shelby specialized in extracting maximum alimony from wealthy husbands, often using children as leverage. Kurt Shea sat in the gallery behind Margaret, trying to look supportive while clearly nervous about being in a courthouse. He didn't know that federal marshals were positioned throughout the building, waiting for their signal. Judge Fernando Bush entered promptly at 9 a.m., his black robes flowing as he took his seat at the bench. Douglas caught the judge's eye briefly, receiving an almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "We're here today for the matter of Herrera versus Herrera," Judge Bush announced. "Plaintiff is seeking dissolution of marriage, spousal support, and child support for twins Emma and Ryan Herrera. Mrs. Lucas, you may proceed." Shelby Lucas stood confidently, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp features. "Your Honor," My client, Margaret Herrera, has been the primary caregiver for 18-month-old twins while her husband, Douglas Herrera, has focused exclusively on his career. She seeks reasonable support to maintain the children's standard of living. What amount are you requesting, counselor? $20,000 monthly for child support, plus $15,000 in spousal support, Your Honor. Mr. Herrera's business generates substantial income, and the children deserve financial security. Douglas remained expressionless as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. $35,000 monthly was an enormous sum, even for someone of his means. Judge Bush turned to Jeff Hampton. Counselor, your response? Jeff stood slowly, his gray hair and lined face conveying decades of courtroom experience. Your Honor, my client contests both the paternity of the children in question and the validity of the marriage itself, based on fraud and criminal conspiracy. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Margaret's face went pale, while Shelby Lucas looked genuinely surprised. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Hampton, Judge Bush said sternly. What evidence do you present to support this claim? Your Honor, we have documentation proving that Mrs. Herrera entered into this marriage under false pretenses, engaging in adultery, theft of marital assets, and participation in industrial espionage targeting my client's business. Shelby Lucas shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. These are inflammatory accusations without foundation. My client is the victim of an abusive husband who refuses to accept responsibility for his children. Douglas watched Margaret carefully. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white with tension. Behind her, Kurt shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Bush raised his hand for silence. Mr. Hampton, if you're going to make such serious accusations, you'd better have extraordinary proof. Jeff smiled. We do, Your Honor. Douglas reached into his jacket and withdrew the envelope, its manila surface containing the power to destroy lives. He handed it to Jeff, who approached the bench with measured steps. Your Honor, this envelope contains DNA test results proving that my client is not the biological father of the children in question, financial records documenting the theft of over $400,000 in marital assets, surveillance photographs of Mrs. Herrera's adultery, and evidence of her participation in a criminal conspiracy. Judge Bush accepted the envelope with appropriate gravity. This is highly irregular, Counselor. The situation itself is highly irregular, Your Honor. As Judge Bush began reviewing the contents, Douglas watched Margaret's face transform from confusion to dawning horror. She whispered urgently to her attorney, who was frantically taking notes. Mrs. Lucas, Judge Bush said without looking up from the documents, are you aware that your client has been under federal investigation for conspiracy and racketeering? The question landed like a bomb. Shelby Lucas's mouth fell open, while Margaret made a strangled sound of protest. No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of any federal investigation. Douglas felt a moment of satisfaction as his careful planning reached fruition. The FBI investigation had been kept secret, known only to a handful of federal prosecutors and Douglas himself. Judge Bush continued reading, his expression growing increasingly grave. Mr. Hampton, these documents allege that Mrs. Herrera was working with one Kent Harrison to steal confidential information from your client's business for purposes of blackmail and extortion. That's correct, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison is the former CEO of Harrison Industries, whom my client helped expose for embezzlement 2 years ago. This entire marriage appears to have been part of an elaborate revenge scheme. Margaret finally found her voice. That's insane. I love my husband. These accusations are completely fabricated. Judge Bush looked at her directly. Mrs. Herrera, these DNA test results indicate that your husband is not the biological father of your children. How do you explain this discrepancy? There must be some mistake. The tests are wrong. Douglas is definitely their father. The tests were conducted by 3 independent laboratories, Mrs. Herrera. The probability of error is essentially 0. Douglas watched as Margaret's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. 18 months of lies were collapsing under the weight of scientific evidence. Shelby Lucas attempted damage control. Your Honor, even if there are questions about paternity, my client still deserves spousal support, and Judge Bush cut her off with a sharp gesture. Counselor, if these allegations are true, your client has committed multiple felonies including fraud, theft, and conspiracy. I'm not inclined to award spousal support to someone who may be facing federal prison time. Douglas saw Kurt start to rise from his seat in the gallery, clearly planning to leave. A subtle hand signal from Douglas alerted the federal marshals, who began moving into position. Your Honor, Jeff continued, we also have evidence that Mrs. Herrera's paramour, Kurt Shea, was conducting surveillance on my client at the direction of Mr. Harrison. This case involves far more than simple adultery. As if on cue, the courtroom doors burst open. Federal marshals entered with arrest warrants, moving with professional efficiency toward their targets. Kurt Shea, the lead marshal, announced loudly, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of federal wiretapping laws." The courtroom erupted in chaos as Kurt tried to flee, only to be tackled by marshals near the exit. Margaret screamed and started to run toward him, but additional marshals moved to intercept her. Margaret Herrera, another marshal, called out, "You're also under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering." Judge Bush banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. "Seal the doors. No one leaves until this situation is resolved." Douglas remained perfectly still in his chair, watching with cold satisfaction as handcuffs were placed on both Margaret and Kurt. This was the moment he'd orchestrated for months, complete and public destruction of those who had betrayed him. "Your Honor," he said calmly as the chaos subsided, "I believe this resolves the question of child support and spousal support." Judge Bush looked at Douglas with something approaching admiration. "Mr. Herrera, I apologize for the inconvenience this fraudulent case has caused you. The court finds no basis for any financial obligations to Mrs. Herrera." As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, she turned back toward Douglas with desperate eyes. "Please, Douglas, think about Emma and Ryan. They need their father." Douglas met her gaze without emotion. "They deserve to know their real father. I'm sure Kurt will provide for them from his prison cell." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Her lawyer, Shelby Lucas, had fainted from the shock of watching her client arrested in open court, and paramedics were attending to her unconscious form. As the courtroom cleared, Douglas gathered his papers with methodical precision. Phase 3 of his plan was complete. Margaret and Kurt were facing federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Kent Harrison would be arrested within the hour. His elaborate revenge scheme turned back on himself with devastating results. But Douglas wasn't finished yet. The final phase would ensure that none of his enemies would ever threaten him again. Chapter 5. The Reckoning Deepens. The federal holding facility buzzed with activity as Douglas arrived for his scheduled meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Regina Atkinson. Through the reinforced glass windows, he could see Margaret in her orange jumpsuit, her auburn hair now stringy after 3 days in custody. Regina, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s, had built her reputation prosecuting white-collar criminals and organized crime figures. She understood the value of Douglas's cooperation in building cases against high-profile targets. "Your information has been invaluable," she said, reviewing the files spread across the conference table. "Harrison's blackmail operation was more extensive than we initially realized. He was targeting over a dozen of your former clients, extorting millions in total." Douglas nodded grimly. Margaret provided him with client files containing their most sensitive personal information: extramarital affairs, financial difficulties, family secrets. Harrison used all of it for leverage. "We've recovered detailed records from his computer systems, bank accounts, payment schedules, even transcripts of his extortion calls. Your wife and Kurt were just the tip of the iceberg." Through the two-way mirror, Douglas observed Margaret speaking with her court-appointed attorney. She looked broken, aged years in just a few days. The confident woman who had demanded $20,000 monthly in child support was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of her crimes. "What kind of plea deals are they seeking?" Douglas asked. "Margaret is trying to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Harrison." She claimed she was manipulated, that she didn't understand the full scope of what she was involved in. Douglas's expression hardened. She understood enough to steal $400,000 from our joint accounts. She understood enough to hand over confidential files that destroyed innocent people's lives. Regina studied his face carefully. You're not interested in showing mercy, are you, Mr. Herrera? Mercy is earned through honesty and accountability. Margaret has shown neither. The truth was more complex than Douglas let on. His investigation had revealed that Margaret's involvement went deeper than anyone suspected. She hadn't been an innocent victim manipulated by Harrison. She had been an active participant from the beginning, helping to identify vulnerable targets among Douglas's clients. Financial records showed that she had received separate payments for specific pieces of intelligence, essentially working as a paid informant against her own husband. The yoga classes, the late nights, the mysterious appointments, all had been meetings with Harrison's associates, planning the destruction of Douglas's business and reputation. What about Kurt Shea? Regina asked. Kurt was the surveillance specialist. He installed listening devices in our home, photographed confidential documents, even recruited other people to monitor my movements. He wasn't just having an affair with my wife. He was running a professional espionage operation. Douglas had discovered that Kurt's construction job was merely a cover. His real profession was industrial espionage, and he had worked for Harrison on multiple projects over the past 5 years. Margaret's affair had been carefully orchestrated to provide access to Douglas's home and office. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their discussion. Agent Danny Parks from the FBI's white-collar crime division entered, his expression grim. We just arrested Harrison at his estate in the Hamptons, Parks reported. He was attempting to flee the country with $15 million in assets hidden in offshore accounts. His private jet was fueled and ready for takeoff to Switzerland. Douglas felt a surge of satisfaction. Harrison's attempt to escape proved his guilt and would eliminate any possibility of successful plea negotiations. Did he resist? Regina asked. Not physically, but he immediately demanded to speak with Margaret Herrera. He seems to think she can provide him with some kind of leverage against prosecution. Douglas smiled coldly. He's about to be disappointed. The truth was that Douglas had anticipated Harrison's arrest and prepared accordingly. Over the past month, he had been feeding Margaret false information about his business dealings and client relationships. She had passed this fabricated intelligence to Harrison, who had based his escape plans on completely inaccurate assumptions. When Harrison's lawyers reviewed the evidence against him, they would discover that their client had been acting on false information provided by Douglas through Margaret. The revelation would destroy any credibility Harrison might have had and make plea negotiations impossible. There's something else, Agent Parks continued. We found evidence of additional victims. Harrison wasn't just targeting your clients. He was running similar operations against other private investigators and corporate security firms. This appears to be part of a systematic campaign to steal industrial secrets and blackmail prominent individuals. Douglas had suspected as much. Harrison's operation was too sophisticated and well-funded to target only one person. His quest for revenge against Douglas had evolved into a broader criminal enterprise. How many other victims? Regina asked. At least 23 individuals, including 3 federal judges, 2 senators, and multiple Fortune 500 CEOs. The total damage could exceed $50 million. The scope of Harrison's crimes meant that Douglas's betrayal by Margaret had inadvertently uncovered one of the largest blackmail schemes in federal history. The irony wasn't lost on him. His wife's treachery had led to the exposure of dozens of other criminals. Through the observation window, Douglas watched Margaret receive news of Harrison's arrest. Her face crumpled as she realized that her benefactor couldn't protect her anymore. She was truly alone, facing decades in federal prison with no hope of rescue. Mr. Herrera, Regina said quietly, I have to ask, are you planning to pursue custody of the twins? Douglas had been dreading this question. Emma and Ryan were innocent children caught in their parents' criminal schemes. Under normal circumstances, he would have fought to protect them from the consequences of adult failures. But these weren't normal circumstances. The children weren't biologically his, and their mother had used them as weapons in her war against everything he had built. Taking custody would mean constant reminders of Margaret's betrayal and Kurt's invasion of his home. Their biological father can provide for them, Douglas said finally. Kurt Shea will have plenty of time to consider his parental responsibilities while serving his federal sentence. Regina nodded, making notes in her file. The children will likely become wards of the state, at least temporarily. Douglas felt a momentary pang of guilt, but he suppressed it ruthlessly. Mercy and sentiment were luxuries he couldn't afford. Margaret had made her choice when she decided to betray their marriage. Kurt had made his choice when he decided to turn espionage into a profession. Harrison had made his choice when he decided to destroy innocent people's lives for profit. None of them would receive forgiveness or second chances from Douglas Herrera. The meeting concluded with final preparations for the upcoming trials. Harrison would face the most serious charges, likely resulting in life imprisonment. Margaret and Kurt would receive significant sentences as well, their cooperation with prosecutors offering only minimal sentence reductions. As Douglas left the federal building, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. His enemies were facing justice, his reputation was intact, and his business would emerge stronger than ever from the controversy. But the final phase of his plan was still ahead. The most personal and devastating revenge was yet to come. Chapter 6. The Web completes. The upscale restaurant's private dining room hummed with quiet conversation as Douglas met with his core team for the final phase of their operation. Around the mahogany table sat Gary Winters, Russell Hanna, and Julius Kane, the men who had helped orchestrate the destruction of Margaret and Kurt's conspiracy. 3 months had passed since the courtroom arrests. Margaret and Kurt were awaiting trial in federal custody, while Harrison had pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty for charges that included conspiracy to murder a federal witness. Douglas's cooperation with authorities had exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of corporate and political society. The media coverage has been extraordinary, Gary reported, sliding newspaper clippings across the table. Harrison's blackmail network made national headlines. Margaret and Kurt are being portrayed as key players in organized crime. Douglas examined the articles with satisfaction. The public narrative painted him as a heroic victim who had single-handedly exposed widespread corruption. His business was receiving more client requests than they could handle, with corporations and wealthy individuals seeking his protection from similar schemes. "What about the civil suits?" he asked Russell. The forensic accountant smiled grimly. "Margaret's creditors are circling like vultures. Her legal fees alone will exceed $2 million, and she has no assets to cover them. The court-appointed attorney is overwhelmed by the complexity of the federal charges." Douglas had anticipated this outcome. Margaret's financial destruction was as important as her criminal prosecution. She would emerge from prison decades later with nothing. No money, no property, no reputation, and no family. "Kurt's situation is even worse," Russell continued. "His surveillance equipment was expensive, and he financed most of it through criminal loans. The people he owes money to are not patient creditors." Julius leaned forward, his expression serious. "That brings us to the final element of your plan, Douglas. Are you certain you want to proceed?" Douglas had wrestled with this decision for weeks. The final phase would cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed, moving from legal revenge into something far more personal and dangerous. Kurt Shea had made a critical mistake during his arrest. In a desperate attempt to appear cooperative, he had provided federal agents with detailed information about his surveillance of Douglas's home and family. The recordings and photographs revealed intimate moments that Douglas had believed were private. Conversations with his daughter from his first marriage, phone calls with his elderly parents, even private moments of grief when he discovered Margaret's betrayal. Kurt had violated the sanctity of Douglas's home and family, turning his most vulnerable moments into evidence for a criminal conspiracy. This transgression demanded punishment beyond what any court could provide. Harrison's criminal network included muscle, Julius reported quietly. People who handled problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. Several of them are now seeking new employment after their employer's arrest. Douglas understood the implication. Former criminals facing uncertain futures might be willing to perform services for the right price, especially if those services involved settling scores with people who had betrayed them. I wanted to look like natural consequences of his choices, Douglas said carefully. Kurt borrowed money from dangerous people to finance his surveillance operation. When he can't repay those debts from prison, creditors might become impatient. Gary nodded slowly. Prison can be a dangerous place for people who owe money to the wrong individuals. Accidents happen, especially to those who violate other men's families. Douglas felt a moment of hesitation. He had served his country with honor, built a successful business through legitimate means, and tried to live according to principles of justice and integrity. What he was contemplating represented a fundamental departure from those values. But Kurt had crossed an unforgivable line. The surveillance of Douglas's family, the violation of his home, the transformation of private moments into weapons for his enemies. These crimes demanded a response that transcended legal justice. What about Margaret? Russell asked. Douglas's expression hardened. Prison will be sufficient punishment for her. 25 to 30 years in federal custody, surrounded by women who understand exactly what she did to her family. She'll have plenty of time to reflect on her choices. The truth was that Douglas's punishment of Margaret would be more subtle, but equally devastating. He had used his connections to ensure that she was housed in a facility known for its harsh treatment of inmates who had betrayed their families. The women she would live among for the next decades included mothers who had lost their children to similar schemes. Margaret would spend every day surrounded by victims of betrayal who understood exactly what she represented. Her life would become a daily reminder of the consequences of destroying families for profit. There's one more element, Julia said, producing a thick folder. The twins. Douglas had been dreading this conversation. Emma and Ryan had been placed in foster care, while authorities searched for Kurt's relatives willing to accept custody. The children were innocent victims, but they were also living reminders of the greatest deception of Douglas's life. Kurt's sister Hannah O'Donnell lives in Oregon, Julius reported. She's been awarded temporary custody, but she's struggling financially. Single mother, works 2 jobs, living in a small apartment. Douglas remained silent, processing the implications. If someone were to provide anonymous financial support, Julius continued carefully, the children could have better opportunities. Private schools, college funds, health care, the kind of life you would have provided if they had actually been yours. Anonymous support creates no legal obligations, Russell added. You would never have to see them or acknowledge any relationship, but they would have the advantages your wealth could provide. Douglas considered this carefully. Supporting the children would be an act of mercy that Margaret didn't deserve. But Emma and Ryan hadn't chosen their parents or participated in the conspiracy that had destroyed his marriage. Set up an educational trust, he decided finally. Enough to ensure they have good opportunities, but structured so they never know the source. Let them build their own lives without the burden of knowing how they were conceived. The meeting concluded with final arrangements for Kurt's fate and the children's future. Douglas felt no joy in what he was orchestrating, but he felt complete certainty in its necessity. Some betrayals couldn't be forgiven or forgotten. Some violations demanded responses that transcended legal justice. Kurt Shea had chosen to make war on Douglas's family, and wars had casualties. As Douglas drove home through the city lights, he reflected on how fundamentally his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a successful businessman with a beautiful wife and beloved children. Now he was a widower in all but name, his family destroyed by the very people he had trusted most. But he was also stronger, wiser, and more dangerous than ever before. The experience had stripped away illusions about loyalty and trust, revealing the cold reality of human nature. Douglas had learned to embrace that reality and use it as a weapon against those who would harm him. The final phase of his revenge was nearly complete. Soon, all debts would be paid in full. Chapter 7. Justice Served Cold. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and camera crews as Douglas emerged from the sentencing hearing. Behind him, through the reinforced glass doors, Margaret sat in shackles awaiting transport back to federal prison. The judge had just sentenced her to 32 years without possibility of parole for her role in Harrison's criminal enterprise. Jeff Hampton walked beside Douglas, fielding questions from aggressive journalists who sensed the dramatic conclusion to one of the year's most sensational cases. "Mr. Herrera, how do you feel about your ex-wife's sentence?" a reporter called out. Douglas paused at the microphone cluster that had been hastily assembled. His navy suit was immaculate, his posture confident, his voice steady as he addressed the cameras. "Justice has been served," he said simply. "Margaret chose to betray not only her marriage, but also the trust of dozens of innocent people who had confided their most personal secrets to my company. The sentence reflects the severity of those choices." "What about the children, sir? Will you seek custody of Emma and Ryan?" Douglas's expression remained impassive. "The children are with their biological father's family, where they belong. I wish them well." The reporter pressed further. "But you raised them as your own for 18 months. Don't you feel any obligation?" "My obligation," Douglas interrupted coldly, "was to my marriage and my business clients, both of which were systematically betrayed by people I trusted. I fulfilled that obligation by ensuring their criminal behavior was exposed and prosecuted." As he walked away from the courthouse, Douglas reflected on the completeness of his victory. Margaret would spend the next 3 decades in federal prison, her beauty fading in an environment that would offer no mercy to someone who had destroyed families for profit. Her fellow inmates included women whose own children had been taken from them through various criminal schemes, and they had little sympathy for mothers who betrayed their families. Harrison was serving life plus 50 years in solitary confinement, his blackmail empire dismantled, and his victims finally free from his extortion. The man who had orchestrated revenge against Douglas had instead achieved his own complete destruction. Gary Winters met Douglas at his car, speaking quietly to report the outcome of the final element of their plan. "Kurt Schade died in his cell last night," Gary said without emotion. "Apparent suicide. He hanged himself with bed sheets after receiving news of Margaret's sentence." Douglas felt a moment of satisfaction, followed by something that might have been relief. Kurt's death eliminated the last active participant in the conspiracy against his family. More importantly, it meant that the twins would never have to visit their biological father in prison or explain his crimes to their children. "Any investigation?" Douglas asked. "Routine autopsy, but no suspicious circumstances." Kurt had been increasingly despondent about his situation. His cellmate reported that he'd been talking about the children and how they would grow up knowing their parents were criminals. Douglas nodded. Kurt's death was genuinely tragic for Emma and Ryan, but it was also a form of mercy. The children would grow up believing their father had died rather than learning that he was a criminal who had violated another man's family for profit. The anonymous trust Douglas had established would provide for their education and basic needs through their Aunt Hannah. She had proven to be a caring guardian who asked no questions about the mysterious benefactor who had made her family's financial struggles disappear overnight. At his office, Douglas found Christina organizing files for the influx of new clients seeking his protection services. The publicity from the Harrison case had transformed his business from a regional operation into a national security firm with waiting lists of corporate and celebrity clients. "Mr. Herrera," Christina said as he entered, "there's been another development. 3 more private investigation firms have reported similar infiltration attempts. The FBI believes Harrison's network included copycat operations." Douglas wasn't surprised. Criminal success often inspired imitation, and Harrison's blackmail scheme had been sophisticated enough to attract other ambitious criminals. The difference was that Douglas now understood how such operations functioned and how to detect them before they could cause damage. "Schedule meetings with the affected firms," he instructed. "We'll provide consultation on counterintelligence measures." The final irony of Margaret's betrayal was that it had made Douglas's business more successful than ever. His experience as a victim of industrial espionage had provided insights that money couldn't buy, making him uniquely qualified to protect others from similar schemes. That evening, Douglas sat in his study reviewing the day's events. On his desk was a single photograph: Emma and Ryan playing in their new backyard in Oregon, unaware that their former stepfather was watching over them from a distance. They looked happy and healthy, adapting to their new life with the resilience that children possessed. Beside the photograph was a newspaper clipping announcing Margaret's sentence. The headline read, "Marriage of Deception, Nurse Sentenced to 32 years for Industrial Espionage." The article described her as an unrepentant criminal who had shown no remorse for her betrayal of family and clients. Douglas folded the newspaper and placed it in his file cabinet, along with all the other documentation of Margaret and Kurt's conspiracy. The physical evidence of their betrayal would be preserved, but their ability to harm anyone else had been permanently eliminated. His secure phone rang. Julius Kane was calling from Washington, where he was consulting with federal agencies about preventing similar criminal networks. "The ripple effects are still spreading," Julius reported. Harrison's client list included individuals in 12 countries. The international implications could take years to fully resolve. What about copycat operations? 3 confirmed, with possibly more under investigation. Your experience has become a case study in how to detect and counter industrial espionage operations targeting private investigators. Douglas smiled grimly. His personal tragedy had become professional expertise. His victimization transformed into a competitive advantage that would protect countless others from similar betrayals. "There's something else," Julius continued. "The Justice Department wants to offer you a consulting contract. They're creating a task force to investigate infiltration of private security firms, and they want your input on detection methods." The offer represented validation of Douglas's methods and a chance to turn his painful experience into service to his country. It would also provide legitimate channels for the kind of counterintelligence work that had become his specialty. "I'll consider it," Douglas replied. After ending the call, Douglas walked to his window and looked out at the city lights. 6 months ago, he had been a betrayed husband facing financial ruin and professional disgrace. Tonight, he was a successful businessman whose expertise was sought by federal agencies and whose reputation had been restored through his enemy's destruction. Margaret had chosen to make war on his family and business. She had lost that war completely, paying with her freedom, her reputation, and her children. Kurt had paid with his life. Harrison had paid with everything he owned and decades of imprisonment. Douglas had learned that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford when dealing with people who viewed compassion as weakness. Some betrayals demanded complete destruction of those responsible, not for satisfaction, but for protection against future threats. The final phase of his revenge was complete. All debts had been paid in full. Chapter 8. The Reckoning Shadow. 2 years after the courthouse triumph, Douglas stood in his expanded offices on the 50th floor of the city's newest high-rise. His company, Herrera Security Solutions, now employed over 200 people and maintained offices in 12 major cities. The Harrison case had become legendary in corporate security circles, and Douglas's methods were studied in business schools as examples of counterintelligence excellence. But success carried its own burdens, and Douglas was discovering that complete victory could be as isolating as defeat. Gary Winters entered the corner office, carrying files on their latest case. A Fortune 500 CEO whose spouse was suspected of corporate espionage. The parallels to Douglas's own experience weren't lost on either man. "The surveillance confirms what we suspected," Gary reported. "Mrs. Chun has been photographing confidential documents and passing them to her brother's investment firm. Classic inside trading scheme." Douglas reviewed the evidence with professional detachment, but the case stirred uncomfortable memories. Every investigation involving spousal betrayal reminded him of Margaret's deception and the price he had paid for trusting someone completely. "Recommendations?" he asked. "We could expose her quietly, allow the client to handle it privately. Or we could involve the SEC and make it a federal case." Douglas considered the options. 2 years ago, he would have chosen maximum destruction without hesitation. But experience had taught him that not every betrayal required complete annihilation of the betrayer. Give the client both options and let him decide. Some marriages can survive infidelity if the underlying relationship is genuine. Gary raised an eyebrow at this unexpected mercy, but said nothing. He had watched Douglas evolve from a man consumed by revenge to someone who understood the difference between justice and destruction. Christina knocked on the office door. "Mr. Herrera, there's someone here to see you." "She says it's about Margaret." Douglas felt his blood freeze. Margaret was serving her sentence in a federal facility in Texas, with no possibility of parole for 3 decades. Any visitor claiming connection to her represented either a threat or an opportunity for manipulation. "Who is she?" "Hannah O'Donnell, sir. She says she's Kurt Shea's sister, the woman raising Emma and Ryan." Douglas had maintained anonymous financial support for the children, but had deliberately avoided any direct contact with their guardian. Seeing her face-to-face would make the situation personal in ways he had carefully avoided. "Send her in." Hannah O'Donnell was a tired-looking woman in her early 30s, wearing clothes that were clean but showed the wear of someone working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had faced hardship but refused to be broken by it. "Mr. Herrera," she said quietly, "I know who's been sending the money." Douglas gestured for her to sit, maintaining his professional composure while calculating potential threats and responses. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ms. O'Donnell." "The educational trust for Emma and Ryan. The anonymous benefactor who made it possible for me to quit my second job and spend time with the children." "I'm not stupid, Mr. Herrera. I know it's you." Douglas studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Hannah appeared genuinely grateful rather than threatening, but he had learned not to trust appearances. "Why are you here?" he asked directly. Hannah reached into her purse and withdrew a worn envelope. "Margaret asked me to give you this. She's been writing letters that the prison won't send because you're not on her approved correspondence list." Douglas stared at the envelope as if it contained explosives. Any communication from Margaret represented a potential reopening of wounds he had spent 2 years healing. "What does she want?" "To apologize, I think, and to thank you for supporting the children even though." Hannah's voice trailed off. Even though they weren't his. Even though their existence was a daily reminder of the greatest betrayal of his life. Even though he had every right to abandon them to the consequences of their parents' crimes. Douglas accepted the envelope but didn't open it. "How are Emma and Ryan?" "They're good kids. Smart, healthy, happy." Emma asks about her other daddy sometimes. "They remember you, but they're adjusting well to life with me." The mention of the children's memories hit Douglas unexpectedly hard. He had tried to erase his emotional connection to Emma and Ryan, but hearing that they remembered him stirred feelings he thought he had buried. "Do they know the truth about their parents?" Hannah shook her head. "I've told them their mother is away and can't visit, and that their father died in an accident. When they're older, I'll explain more, but right now, they just need stability and love." Douglas appreciated her wisdom. Children Emma and Ryan's age couldn't understand concepts like conspiracy and betrayal, but they could understand absence and loss. Hannah was protecting them from adult complexities while providing the security they needed. "Ms. O'Donnell," Douglas said carefully, "the financial support will continue through their 18th birthdays, regardless of Margaret's requests or my personal feelings about the situation. But I won't be a presence in their lives. They need to build their identities without the complications my involvement would create." Hannah nodded, understanding the boundaries he was establishing. "I think that's wise. But I wanted you to know that they're being raised to understand kindness and generosity, even when it comes from unexpected sources." After she left, Douglas sat alone with Margaret's letter, debating whether to read it or destroy it unopened. Any message from her would contain manipulation, self-justification, or appeals for forgiveness that he wasn't prepared to consider. But curiosity eventually overcame caution. He opened the envelope and found 3 pages of careful handwriting on prison stationery. "Douglas," the letter began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I know you have every reason to hate me. But I need you to understand that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. Douglas felt anger rising as he read Margaret's attempt to minimize her responsibility. She described her involvement with Harrison as a mistake that spiraled out of control, claiming she had been manipulated by forces beyond her understanding. "I was weak and selfish," she wrote, "but I never stopped loving you. When I learned about the twins' paternity, I was terrified of losing you, so I said nothing. That cowardice led to everything else." The letter continued for 2 more pages, describing her regret and her gratitude that Douglas was supporting the children despite everything. She claimed to understand his decision to cut all ties and promised never to contact him again. Douglas read the entire letter twice, then fed it into his office shredder. Margaret's words contained elements of truth mixed with self-serving distortions designed to elicit sympathy. She was still trying to manipulate him, still refusing to accept complete responsibility for her choices. But the letter had accomplished something Margaret probably hadn't intended. It reminded Douglas that revenge, no matter how complete, couldn't undo the past or restore what had been lost. Margaret was paying for her crimes with decades of imprisonment, but Douglas was also paying with isolation and an inability to trust anyone completely. His phone buzzed with a text from Regina Atkinson, the prosecutor who had handled Harrison's case. New development in the Harrison network. "Can we meet tomorrow?" Douglas smiled grimly. Even with Margaret imprisoned, Kurt dead, and Harrison serving life, their criminal legacy continued to create ripple effects. The work of justice was never truly finished. As evening fell over the city, Douglas stood at his window, thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. He had achieved complete victory over his enemies, built a thriving business from their betrayal, and established himself as one of the most respected security professionals in the country. But he was also alone, surrounded by employees and clients, but connected to no one on a personal level. The experience with Margaret had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, leaving him professionally successful but emotionally isolated. In Oregon, Emma and Ryan were growing up without knowing their benefactor's identity, protected from the truth about their parents, but also separated from someone who had genuinely loved them. Their happiness came at the cost of his connection to the only family he had ever known. Douglas had learned that complete revenge carried its own price. Destroying his enemies had also destroyed part of himself, leaving him powerful but empty, victorious but alone. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new clients, new opportunities to protect others from the betrayals he had experienced. But tonight, he stood alone in his tower of success, master of his domain, but prisoner of his own perfectionism. Some victories, he realized, were indistinguishable from defeat. Chapter 9. The Final Price. 5 years had passed since the courtroom, where Judge Fernando Bush had apologized for Douglas's inconvenience. Now, Douglas sat in a different courtroom, this time as a witness in a congressional hearing on corporate espionage and private intelligence firms. His expertise, born from personal tragedy, had made him one of the nation's leading authorities on counterintelligence. Senator Christina Lindsay, chair of the Intelligence Committee, addressed him directly from the elevated panel. "Mr. Herrera, your company has prevented over 40 confirmed infiltration attempts in the past 3 years. What patterns have you observed in these operations?" Douglas leaned into the microphone, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "Senator, most successful infiltrations exploit personal relationships and emotional vulnerabilities. The Harrison Network succeeded initially because they understood that people in positions of trust often have the least scrutiny applied to them." The hearing was being broadcast live, another chapter in Douglas's transformation from victim to expert. His testimony would influence federal policy on private intelligence oversight and corporate security protocols. During a recess, Douglas stepped outside the Capitol building to find Gary Winters waiting with urgent news. "We have a problem," Gary said quietly. "Hannah O'Donnell was in a car accident yesterday. She's in intensive care, and the children have been placed in emergency foster care." Douglas felt the world shift beneath his feet. Emma and Ryan, now 6 years old, were once again facing upheaval in their young lives. Their guardian, the woman who had provided stability and love, was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. What are her chances? Douglas asked. 50-50, according to the doctors. Internal injuries, possible brain trauma. Even if she recovers, it could be months of rehabilitation. Douglas closed his eyes, processing the implications. Emma and Ryan would be placed with strangers while their legal guardian recovered, if she recovered at all. The children would face questions about their parents, their history, their future, questions that Hannah had carefully shielded them from answering. Sir, Gary continued carefully, you're listed as an emergency contact on the school forms. Hannah put you down as someone who could make decisions if something happened to her. This revelation stunned Douglas. Hannah had secretly maintained his connection to the children's lives, acknowledging his role as their silent benefactor and protector. She had trusted him with their welfare, despite his explicit wishes to remain anonymous. The social worker assigned to their case is Violet York, Gary reported. She's reviewing potential placements, but she's also asking questions about the anonymous trust fund and Hannah's financial situation. Our careful anonymity might not survive a formal investigation. Douglas realized that his past had finally caught up with him. 5 years of maintaining distance from Emma and Ryan had protected him from emotional complications, but it had also left the children vulnerable when their guardian could no longer provide for them. He walked back into the Capitol building and requested a private meeting with Senator Lindsay. As chair of the Intelligence Committee, she had the authority to make discreet inquiries that could help resolve the children's situation without public exposure. Senator, I need a personal favor, Douglas said once they were alone in her office. Christina Lindsay was a shrewd politician who understood the value of relationships with people like Douglas. His expertise had helped her committee expose several intelligence failures, and she owed him consideration for personal requests. What do you need, Douglas? He explained the situation with Emma and Ryan, omitting details about Margaret and Kurt, but emphasizing the children's need for stable placement with someone who understood their complex background. These children were collateral damage in a case I worked years ago, he said carefully. Their guardian has been incapacitated, and they need someone who can provide both security and stability. Senator Lindsay understood the implications without requiring explicit details. Are you asking me to facilitate your custody petition? Douglas hadn't consciously decided to seek custody until the words left his mouth, but he realized that he had been preparing for this moment since Hannah's first visit to his office. The children needed him, regardless of his emotional reservations about their parentage. Yes, he said simply, I am. The custody process moved quickly with Senator Lindsay's discreet intervention. Social services found Douglas's background check exemplary, his financial resources abundant, and his motivation clear. The children's anonymous benefactor revealing himself as their prospective guardian simplified legal complexities that might have taken months to resolve. 3 weeks later, Douglas stood in a small courtroom in Oregon as Judge Keith Lynn approved the custody transfer. Emma and Ryan sat in the front row with a social worker, both children looking lost and confused by the adult proceedings determining their future. Emma, now 6 years old with Margaret's auburn hair and intelligent green eyes, watched Douglas with careful attention. Ryan, quieter and more reserved, clutched a stuffed animal that Douglas remembered buying for him years earlier. Mr. Herrera, Judge Lynn said formally, you understand that adopting these children creates permanent legal obligations that cannot be dissolved based on convenience or changing circumstances. I understand completely, Your Honor, and you're prepared to raise them with full knowledge of their family history and the circumstances that brought them into your care? Douglas looked at Emma and Ryan, seeing them clearly for the first time in years. They were innocent victims of their parents' crimes, but they were also children who needed stability, guidance, and someone willing to accept responsibility for their welfare. Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared for that responsibility. The gavel came down with finality. Emma and Ryan Herrera were officially his children, carrying his name and his commitment to their future welfare. That evening, in the hotel suite where they would spend their last night in Oregon, Douglas sat with the children as they ate room service dinner and processed the day's events. Are you our new daddy? Emma asked with the directness that children possessed. Douglas chose his words carefully. "I'm going to take care of you and make sure you have everything you need to grow up happy and healthy." "What happened to our other daddy?" Ryan asked quietly. "He had to go away," Douglas replied, using Hannah's carefully constructed explanation. "But he loved you very much, and he wanted someone to take care of you if he couldn't." The conversation continued with gentle questions and patient answers. Douglas drawing on reserves of compassion he thought he had exhausted years earlier. These children needed honesty appropriate to their age, stability after years of upheaval, and someone willing to help them build identities separate from their parents' crimes. Over the following months, Douglas discovered that raising Emma and Ryan required him to confront emotions he had carefully suppressed since Margaret's betrayal. The children's presence in his life forced him to choose between the isolation that protected him from vulnerability and the connections that made life meaningful. Emma inherited her mother's intelligence, but channeled it into curiosity about the world rather than manipulation of people. Ryan possessed his father's technical aptitude, but used it for building rather than surveillance. Both children showed resilience and adaptability that impressed Douglas daily. 6 months after the adoption, Douglas received word that Hannah had recovered sufficiently to resume normal activities. She requested a meeting to see how the children were adjusting to their new life. "They're thriving," Hannah observed as they watched Emma and Ryan play in Douglas's backyard. "You've given them something I never could: complete security and unlimited opportunities." Douglas had transformed his life to accommodate the children's needs. His business remained successful, but he had reduced travel and delegated operational responsibilities to spend time with family activities. The man who had once worked 16-hour days now attended school plays and soccer games. "Do you regret taking them?" Hannah asked quietly. Douglas considered the question seriously. Adopting Emma and Ryan had complicated his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Every decision now involved consideration of their welfare. Every risk to his business became a threat to their security. His carefully constructed emotional walls had been breached by 2 small children who needed more than financial support. But watching Emma help Ryan with his homework, seeing them laugh at cartoons, hearing them call him Dad with genuine affection, these experiences had restored something in Douglas that he hadn't realized was missing. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it." That night, after Emma and Ryan were asleep in their bedrooms, Douglas sat in his study reviewing the journey that had brought him to this moment. Margaret was still serving her sentence in federal prison, with 2 decades remaining before her earliest possible release. Kurt was buried in an unmarked grave, his crimes forgotten by everyone except those he had victimized. Harrison had died in prison the previous year, his criminal empire a cautionary tale studied by law enforcement agencies. But Emma and Ryan were building lives unburdened by their parents' choices. They would grow up with advantages their biological parents could never have provided, protected by someone who understood the cost of betrayal and the value of genuine loyalty. Douglas had learned that complete revenge was possible, but ultimately hollow. Destroying his enemies had provided satisfaction, but not fulfillment. Only when he accepted responsibility for protecting innocence rather than punishing guilt did he discover that victory could coexist with compassion. The envelope he had handed Judge Bush 5 years earlier had contained evidence that destroyed lives and exposed crimes. But it had also set in motion events that ultimately created the family he had always wanted, built on truth rather than deception. Douglas Herrera had never forgiven betrayal, and he never would. But he had learned to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between punishment and protection, between the destruction of enemies and the nurturing of innocence. His final victory was not the ruin of those who had wronged him, but the creation of something genuine and lasting from the ashes of their deception.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.